Going live. And we are live. Um, Hello, all the humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Sunday speaker event. Remember, if you like our content, please press the like button and subscribe to get more of our awesome content. Or better yet, join Patreon or become a member of HSGP. Today's presentation aligns with the values of humanism by critical thinking. Exercising our minds to build these skills enables us to challenge biases in ourselves and in others, paving the way for a fair, open-minded, and autonomous perspective that fosters a multicultural worldview. Ethical development. Ethical development is a never-ending process that requires constant reflection and evaluation of our personal choices and the consequences they have on others. We should continually adapt and rebuild our moral frameworks with the goal of becoming ever better human beings. And finally, peace and social justice. True peace involves an intense commitment to social justice and affirms the human rights and personal autonomy of all people. We attain peace only by consistently responding to injustice through thoughtful conflict resolution that aims to repair harms and ensure a fair and equitable society moving forward. Today, we have Andrew Seidel with How Christian Nationalism Is Un-American. Andrew Seidel is an author and a constitutional and civil rights attorney. He is the director of strategic response at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where he works to keep state and church separate and educate the public about nonbelief. His first book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American, came out 20 months before the Christian nationalists attacked the Capitol and proved his title correct. Renowned constitutional scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, who described it as a beautifully written book that explodes a frequently expressed myth that the United States was created as a Christian nation. It was also burned by a Christian nationalist preacher, and Andrew writes widely numerous outlets and is working on a second book, Weaponizing Religious Freedom, due out next spring. Please give a big HSGP welcome to Andrew Seidel.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate that warm welcome. I see everybody clapping here on my screen, even if I can't hear it. Yeah, it's not often that you choose a subtitle for a book and then the subject runs out to prove you right. It was terrible and haunting to watch, but vindicating in a way, because exactly 4 months ago now, almost 4 months ago, Christian nationalists attacked American democracy, and they attempted to overturn the results of a free and fair election and proved beyond all doubt that Christian nationalism is un-American. If you're not familiar with the term Christian nationalism, it's basically the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles, and that we've strayed from that foundation, that we've got to return to those godly roots. And for a long time, it has been treated as a historical debate. But on January 6th, Christian nationalism ripped off its mask, and it showed that it's not a scholarly debate about how America was founded, but a violent exclusionary movement that is bent on seizing power in the here and now. And the insurrection really launched this conversation that some of us, Andrew Whitehead, Sam Perry, Catherine Stewart, Robbie Jones, Chrissy Stroop, Sarah Posner, Jack Jenkins, Michelle Goldberg, Jeff Charlotte, and many more, that we'd been having kind of on the margins, and it launched that conversation into the mainstream. And since January 6th, I have been just immersed and scouring the photos and videos and watching court proceedings and digging through the court documents. And dipping your toe into this world is alarming. Immersing yourself into it is just, you have to take a shower afterwards. And I am more convinced than ever about the role that Christian nationalism played in attacking, in assaulting, in working to undermine and really end our democracy. And I'm sure many of you, like me, watched in horror as that assault unfolded on January 6th in real time. But I just want to set the stage a little bit and remind you about some of the Christian nationalism from that day. It's easy to forget, especially with everything. I mean, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, everything else that's going on. It's hard to remember. So let's just take a little trip back. Paula White, the scam evangelist, the televangelist, began the day with a prayer. And in true Christian nationalist fashion, she added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer that is written in Matthew 6. So she added America to a prayer that, according to the Bible, Jesus himself prescribed and crafted. It's also the same chapter where Jesus tells people to pray in private and not in public like hypocrites so that they can be seen praying by others. But for some reason, Christian nationalists always ignore that biblical command. The rally that began with that prayer ended with Trump calling on his mob to march to the Capitol. His last words were those that Nixon used to distract the country from Watergate. God bless you and God bless America. I tell the story in The Founding Myth about how the first time a president ended an address with that was Nixon in the Oval Office, trying to distract everybody from Watergate. Impromptu worship concerts broke out on the short walk from the rally to the Capitol. And on their march to the Capitol, the Proud Boys were hailed as God's warriors. They knelt in prayer that was full of typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation. They marched and then they attacked. One attacker carried a Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. The absurdly self-proclaimed QAnon shaman, who has been active in your fine state, led a prayer in the Senate about patriotism, Jesus, and restoring the nation, and he ended it in Jesus's name. One of the praying insurrectionists gave an interview later, and he talked about that prayer, saying of the Senate, we, quote, consecrated it to Jesus. That, to me, is the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement. Indeed, it is. He's not wrong about that. A third praying insurrectionist posted a video saying, quote, I just wanted to get inside the building so I could plead the blood of Jesus over it. That was my goal. He spends 40 minutes in this video recounting every act, most of it pleading the blood. And then he attributes his every action to a dialogue that he had with Jesus. And he's recounting this dialogue in the video. Basically, God told him to do it. He said that when he goes to prison for his crimes, he's going to start a prison ministry. Another insurrectionist who was sipping a post-assault beer told her social media followers why she attacked the beating heart of American democracy. She said, quote, to me, God and country are tied. To me, they're one and the same. We were founded as a Christian country, and we see how far we've come from that. We are a godly country. We are founded on godly principles. And the idea that we are a Christian country and that we have slipped from those founding principles, that is one of the central tenets of Christian nationalism. And that's their primary justification, not only for attacking the Capitol, but for these harmful, retrogressive public policies. And the imagery of that day is now infamous. I'm sure everybody remembers that huge wooden cross juxtaposed with the gallows from which they said they wanted to hang public officials, elected officials, including the vice president. They actually signed the gallows as if it were like a yearbook, writing, hang them high, in God we trust, God bless the USA, hang for treason, and amen. The flags and the signs were just abundantly clear. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. One nation under God, in God we trust, Jesus saves, Jesus 2020, Bible verses, crosses. One sign simply said, I am on your side, signed God. There were Catholic images of Jesus and Mary on banners, on framed paintings, and actually statues borne atop poles that the attackers carried over the heads of everybody else. One of the attackers raised a Bible above the crowd, like a Napoleonic eagle, as the mob is surging through one of the entrances. One of the people who entered the Capitol was a Catholic priest who admitted on camera to exorcising the demon Baphomet while he was inside the Capitol. Another was a youth pastor from Florida. Others were missionaries. They sang the battle hymn of the Republic, glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on, and prayed in the rotunda. One of the groups that helped organize a lot of the events leading up to January 6th, including rallies at the Supreme Court, rallies on the National Mall in December. It was called Jericho March. It was founded by two federal workers who claimed they were sent visions from God to, quote, let the church roar. If you remember your Bible, the Battle of Jericho was a genocide. In that story, the biblical God orders his followers to march around a city while blowing shofars, ram's horns, and carrying the ark that holds his commandments, and then to violently attack and sack the city, steal the valuables, and murder every living thing, including animals. So the Jericho March baptized itself after a biblical genocide and then reenacted that slaughter by blowing shofars, marching around government buildings in DC and in state capitals, and declaring that this is one nation under God, and organizing rallies alongside the Stop the Steal charlatans. So it wasn't just imagery and rhetoric. It was a devout belief that this is a Christian nation and that God chose Donald Trump. Remember Trump himself looked up, he was doing this interview in front of the White House, I believe. He looked up and said, I am the chosen one. Remember that? They think Donald Trump was chosen by God and that God is on their side. The attacker who kicked in Speaker Pelosi's door, hoping to, quote, tear her into little pieces, was actually an attorney. And his rantings were recounted at one of the hearings after he was charged. And he said, quote, God is on Trump's side. God is not on the Democrats' side. And if patriots have to kill 60 million of these communists, it is God's will. It's God's will. There were, of course, other motivations and drivers of the attack. But this Christian nationalist permission structure, doing God's will, fighting for God's law, returning the country to its Christian roots, pervaded the other obvious drivers of the attack. So for instance, the insurrection had this very distinctive QAnon flavor, as I'm sure you all remember. But study after study is exposing the link between QAnon and Christian nationalism and or white evangelicalism. And this was largely a white crowd, right? The Black Lives Matter protesters in DC neither received nor expected such leniency that summer. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, Trump warned in May 2020, quoting a phrase that has a really long and very racist history. Trump had those peaceful protesters gassed, beaten, and brutalized with rubber bullets so that he could walk to church and pose with a Bible for a photo op. And the point of that malignant stroll was to show that we are a Bible-believing, Bible-beating Christian nation, and anyone else who disagrees should be beaten and gassed. I mean, this was a scene that harkened back to some of our most shameful history. So when we're speaking about Christian nationalism, we're speaking about white Christian nationalism. And this was a privileged mob that roamed the halls without fear, brazenly entitled. Now, perhaps they mistakenly believed that Trump would pardon them, but they certainly believed. We know they believed because they said so repeatedly into their cell phones and then broadcast it for the world to see, that this is their country given to them by their God and that they are acting on his orders and defending his chosen one. And when reality collides with a belief system like that, violence is almost inevitable. Entitlement and violence. And all of it really based on disinformation. And that to me is one of the key things that we are dealing with here. And it's one of the reasons that I wrote my book. Christian nationalism is an entire identity based on disinformation. Again, it's not a scholarly debate about our history. It's a sinister exclusionary movement. It's an attempt to redefine America according to the Christian nationalist disinformation and then reshape our law accordingly. And you've heard this disinformation before many times. If you've heard me speak, you've heard me talk about it. It's things like we're one nation under God and in God we trust, and that the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times, and that the founding fathers prayed at the Constitutional Convention, and George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed, and that our laws are based on the Golden Rule, and more importantly, they're based on the 10 Commandments. None of which is true. Without their origin myths, without that disinformation, their identity withers. Their entire political and ideological reality is vulnerable because it is based on disinformation. And it also becomes clear when you explore the myth and the lies that this really and truly is an un-American political ideology. It's not just that this identity is based on disinformation. It's bigger than that. It's that Judeo-Christian principles, especially those that are central to the Christian nationalist identity, are thoroughly opposed to the principles on which the United States was built. The two systems differ and conflict in irreconcilable and fundamental ways. And that is the argument that I make in the founding myth. That is what is new about the book, which you have probably not encountered before if you've not read it. Now, before I open this up, I always like to take one of the more common myths. And I've been seeing this a little bit more this time of year. First of all, because we're a little after Easter, and then North Dakota is doing some stupid stuff with 10 Commandments. So are some other states, including Florida, talking about changing their educational guidelines to include the influence of the 10 Commandments on American law and government, which is not a thing. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how the 10 Commandments fundamentally conflict with our nation's core principles. So right at the start, yeah, some of the 10 Commandments overlap with criminal laws that prohibit murder and theft and perjury, including laws in your state. But those rules are not exclusive or original to Judeo-Christianity. They are universal human principles, humanist principles, that every successful society we know of has adopted. And there's actually really compelling evidence to suggest that the biblical version of these prohibitions didn't apply to anyone but fellow believers. In other words, the biblical version of these universal principles was not universal. Either way, it is very hard to credibly claim that the biblical iterations of these universal rules influenced the founding of the United States. And the rest of the 10 Commandments are downright un-American. They begin, "I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me." So that is a divine command that embodies principles which directly conflict with the principles on which the United States was founded. No law can tell an American to worship a god, let alone which god to worship. Americans are free to be godless, and a growing number of us are, or if they wish, they can worship every god from every holy book. Right? That's not something you get to tell us what to do. The commandments continue in this un-American vein. They prohibit the free expression and art, engraven images and idols. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain. They sanction slavery twice. That's in Exodus 20:10 and also 17, if you're interested in looking that up. The 10 Commandments even promise, and this just blows my mind, to punish innocent children to the third and fourth generation. So grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-great-grandchildren, and then probably one more. Why? You get that punishment if your parents are brazen enough to exercise the religious freedom guaranteed in the First Amendment of the US Constitution. I mean, you can't get more un-American. Not only punishing innocent people deliberately, children deliberately, but for the crime of exercising religious freedom. And the 10th commandment might even be the worst, what some religions label the 10th commandment. It condones slavery, it treats women as chattel, and it criminalizes thought. And incidentally, and this is pretty remarkable, I think, most of the 10 Commandments monuments that you see in public spaces, if you go to, for instance, the Capitol grounds in Colorado, in Denver, or in Texas, in Austin, you'll see 10 Commandments monuments. And most of those that you see edit out the more horrific parts that I just recited, the punishing innocent children. A lot of them edit out the slavery lines. So think about what a damning statement that is. Right? We use our morality to cut out the immoral parts of the 10 Commandments, including the mentions of slavery and punishing innocent children. We are more moral than God's most moral laws, according to the stone monuments that they put up. And they don't even realize this. Now, and the comparison between Christianity and the American constitutional system continues like this. I could list more, but I do want to get to questions. So let me start wrapping this up here. We can beat Christian nationalism. I firmly believe that. Having been immersed in this world, I know we can relegate it back to the fringe whence it came by exposing the disinformation that feeds the identity. We aren't going to convince all the Christian nationalists to change, but we can alert most of the country to the danger, and we can prevent our government from giving aid and succor to this un-American identity that assaulted our democracy. Again, the entire identity is based on lies and myths, but it's validated by modern representations of the myths that previous Christian nationalists have imposed on the country during times of crisis. Right? So their erroneous beliefs are validated when they see "In God We Trust" on our money, or on a government building, or when they are told as school children to pledge that this is one nation under God. Congress opens with prayers that assure every Christian nationalist that this is indeed his America. The Ten Commandments monuments that sit on government property, proclaiming at the beginning, "I am the Lord thy God." The Christian nationalist identity draws legitimacy from these artifacts that have been left by previous waves of Christian nationalists. Right? We've had waves of Christian nationalism throughout our history. We've endured those, but they leave behind these relics that are really like disfiguring scars, which ought to remind us that Christian nationalists have justified slavery, that they've sanctified segregation, and now inspired an insurrection. Instead, these scars reinforce this un-American identity. So until we erase those scars, we're giving aid and comfort to a traitor to the American philosophy. So America is, at its most basic level, if you strip everything away, America is a shared idea. And Christian nationalism refuses to share. It excludes non-Christians and the wrong kind of Christians. So America will never be a Christian nation, because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. These two things cannot peacefully coexist. One will triumph. This is the choice that we face as a nation: Christian nationalism or America. We cannot have both. Thank you. And Ron, I know you want to take questions. I'll just say two things real quick while you're kind of getting ready to do that. There's a ton more information, obviously, in the book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American, which, as Ron mentioned, was burned by a Christian nationalist preacher. That preacher was actually in DC for these rallies. He was speaking at a rally the night before in place of one of the Proud Boys leaders, Enrique Tarrio, who was banned by a judge from going to DC. So Greg Locke filled in. So if you want to get a signed copy of the book that scared the man who helped stoke the fires of the insurrection to the point where he took a blowtorch to the book, you can do that through FFRF's website. So I'm signing copies of the book through the FFRF website. If you go to ffrf.org, and you'll find we have a store, and when you're checking out, there's like a little box, and you just write in the box, I'd like Andrew to sign it, and if you want me to write something in it, like for Ron or whatever, I'm happy to do that. Just leave it in the note. And those signed copies are going to be collector's editions soon, because The Founding Myth is coming out on paperback later this year. And it's going to include a bunch of new stuff in the epilogue that is going to focus on the January 6th insurrection. A lot of what I talked about today, I kind of synthesized from that epilogue that I was writing. And I'm not going to be, as of right now, I don't think this is going to happen, I'm not going to be signing paperback copies. So if you want to order a signed copy, you're not going to be missing anything. If you want to order the paperback copy, pre-orders are being taken right now, and they're like super helpful for authors, because that's how, so for instance, if you do a pre-order through Amazon, Amazon then buys an additional 3 books to sell later on. So you're buying like 4 books for the price of 1 from me, and it's super helpful. Anyway, you can do that at, Ron has the link somewhere. I think he can share it. But anyway, I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Andrew. That was amazing, and I will be taking little snippets of that. Specifically, I was stunned to hear all of the ways that Christian nationalism was present in the January 6th stuff. I had not.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Ron. Those are highlights. I mean, there's so much more, and I actually had the good fortune to speak on a panel to a number of members of Congress. There's 10 or 15 members of Congress that hosted a panel on Christian nationalism's role in the Capitol insurrection. And I kind of recited some of that, and they experienced this, right? They were there for this. This was an assault on them, and they were surprised at the end. I chatted with some of them about how much there was too. So you're not alone in that. You're in very good company. But yeah, I mean, and that's just scratching the surface.
So you had mentioned we can beat Christian nationalism by exposing disinformation. I have friends that are progressive Christians. How do we show them that this is rooted in violence and not the love of Jesus as they all espouse? And please raise your hand or ask questions in chat if you would like to ask questions.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's one that all the people I kind of mentioned at the beginning who've been having this conversation have been struggling with. You know, how can we do this? And I think the first thing we need to understand is demographically, when you're talking about Christian nationalism, about a quarter of the country, 25%, is like hardcore Christian nationalists. On the other end of the spectrum, about a quarter of the country are like me. They reject Christian nationalism entirely. They recognize that it's violent, that it's un-American, that it's a threat to the country. And then there's another quarter that's a step down from me, that is opposed to Christian nationalism, at least in their minds, maybe not vocally, maybe I haven't really thought a whole lot about it. And then on the other side, a step up from the full-on Christian nationalists is kind of the same thing. They're sympathetic to Christian nationalism, but haven't really maybe thought about it. So that middle 50% is who we can convince, is who we can explain this is a threat to our democracy. It's a threat to the American principles that we hold dear, that have actually helped to advance this country. There are plenty that have held us back, don't get me wrong. But I think focusing our efforts on them, which would include a lot of your the progressive Christian friends that you mentioned, is a really good start. And there are a number of groups that are doing this, including the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I advance a lot of arguments in my book that are meant to do this as well. Specifically, there are a lot of Christians out there who were homeschooled or who went to private Christian schools who learned a very different and Christian nationalist version of American history, and what we are and what we are meant to be as a country that just does not. It's just not accurate based on disinformation. Correcting that can be very helpful. There are groups like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is a group that's run by the Baptist Joint Committee, a great organization. They were also on that panel that I mentioned earlier. Amanda Tyler, who runs the organization, was on that congressional panel with me. And Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who are they are probably the two top researchers when it comes to Christian nationalism in the country, are also members of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism group. That is, having people who are willing to say, I'm a Christian and I'm against Christian nationalism, is very, very helpful. And it's a more palatable argument for a lot of the people in that middle 50%. So that's kind of a good place to start. But the number one thing that I tell people to do is to challenge it everywhere you see it. So many these lies and myths are repeated at every turn. You'll see it thousands and thousands of times a day online if you are ever talking about these things. And I wrote the founding myth over the course of 10 years of having these conversations and seeing the Christian nationalism in this country intensify and getting more and more worried about where it was going. And I have not encountered an argument that is not addressed in the founding myth.
Yeah, I tend to avoid those and not get into it because it becomes very contentious.
Well,
Yeah.
and you know, I mean, it's a good point, Ron. And I think the thing that I always try to tell people about when you're having these conversations is one, you really do need to listen to what the other side is saying, and even learning how to be an active listener and repeat back to them what they're saying so you understand, and then ripping the argument apart is a much more effective way than just, you know, kind of trying to attack their argument at the beginning. And also, I think a lot of people get frustrated having these conversations because our expectations going into the conversation are wrong, in that you know you have the facts on your side and you expect that and the reality to triumph. And that's just not the way it operates. Almost always the person is going to become more entrenched in their viewpoint by the end of the conversation. You're not looking to change their mind now. You're looking to put that seed of doubt in their mind and give them a resource, a place to go, another place they can follow up when that doubt starts growing and can't be ignored anymore. So, and I think a lot of people just miss that, and they expect to go into the conversation, I'm going to convince these people they're wrong, and it's just never going to happen. I mean, I won't say never, but rarely is that going to happen. It takes a particularly good rhetoric and a particularly open-minded person on the other end, and those two things rarely overlap. So, I mean, you should be thinking about more of a long game than anything kind of short term, and correcting somebody's misperceptions right away.
Okay. I have a couple questions here in chat that I'd like to ask. The first one from Andrew: do you support any kind of legislation that would further the cause of secularism?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of legislation and model legislation out there that we at the Freedom from Religion Foundation have looked at and would like to see happen. You know, I mean, the last few years, we've been playing defense on a lot of that federally. Same thing in terms of a lot of the states. But yeah, I mean, you know, equalizing the treatment between churches and other nonprofits, for instance, one great example would be having churches file Form 990s, which every other nonprofit in the country has to file. And essentially it's just a financial disclosure. It's how much money you take in, where you spend that money. And that's because tax exemption is a privilege, not a right. And it's a public trust. And that trust requires transparency. So it'd be perfectly natural to say, yes, if you are not going to pay taxes, we at least get to have some sort of transparency and know what you're taking in and where that money's going. And that's what we have for every nonprofit except churches. And I'd really like to see that. And by the way, that would actually be remarkably helpful for churches because they don't have to file this financial disclosures with the IRS. They happen to be very bad about it, tracking their own money, and that makes them uniquely susceptible to fraud and abuse. And just the numbers, if you get into that, which I have because we've drafted some model legislation there, are just astounding. How much money churches lose to internal fraud and abuse.
Okay. Lacey Hinton asks, she noticed that the QAnon shaman had tattoos of Odin's hammer and the world tree, both Norse pagan symbols. Why is this permitted in Christian nationalist circles? This should be a clear violation of the first commandment. Why the cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would ever accuse any Christian nationalist of intellectual uniformity. I'm trying to be polite here. Yeah, and I mean, you know, so the QAnon shaman's really just a really interesting, strange character. I mean, there's so much pageantry involved in that show. He also, as his case was progressing, asked for and eventually received from a judge an accommodation to only get organic meals while he's in jail. And I mean, again, you also see the overlap with Q, and you see the overlap with Trump. They are treating Trump like a savior, which ought to be out of bounds in Christianity anyway, right? I mean, remember back to that day and go look back at some of that imagery, right? They hold Donald Trump up as their savior, as a Jesus-like figure. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, and there's a lot of internal conflict in Christian nationalism itself. But again, this is an entire identity that is based on disinformation, on things that are simply not true. I mean, the contradictions are all over the place. There's no intellectual coherence or consistency at all. I mean, again, just go back to Paula White praying to open up that rally, not only amending the prayer that Jesus supposedly wrote down or said and was supposedly taken down and as Jesus' prayer in the Bible. Like, I mean, imagine being a believing Christian and having the audacity to amend Jesus's words to make them better by adding the United States of America to one of his prayers. And then, violating what he says in Matthew 6, chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, which is, just a few verses away from that prayer, where he tells people not to pray in public that they may be seen by others, because that's what hypocrites do. Instead, go and pray in secret. I mean, she's praying before an audience of millions. And that's also her gig. I mean, that's also what she does. I mean, so the contradictions are all over the place. And I don't know how far we get by pointing them out, but you can get places by helping augment that dissonance in their minds, and it's kind of what I was talking about earlier, by planting those seeds of doubt. So yeah, really interesting question, to which I don't have a good answer, because I honestly don't know. I don't know how you can maintain those kind of levels of dissonance.
Yeah, Jordan points out in chat that you want to increase that cognitive dissonance and plant all those different seeds to make it harder and harder to hold that worldview. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if you take the mitzvot, if you take the 613 commandments that are in the Old Testament seriously, you wouldn't be getting tattoos in the first place either. There's all kinds of stuff. So,
yeah. Steve Trezisi asks, have you provided your model legislation to any legislators in Arizona? And I would kind of change that to Project Blitz has a set of model legislation that's particularly Christian nationalistic. Are there any sets of legislation that are particularly secular in doing that kind of counterpoint to that?
Not to the level of Project Blitz. I will say that I have been in contact with Secular Coalition for Arizona. I mean, I've known Tori for almost a decade now and worked with her a lot. I've also worked with Senator Mendez and Representative Athena Salmon, and I spoke at their secular lunch a couple weeks ago, and we have been working on, as a secular movement, not we just FFRF here, working on trying to build some of these things up. The problem is that we are playing so much defense at the same time as we are trying to do some minimal offense. It's pretty hard. And, two other considerations that we have are, I mean, without a lot of the democratic reform, and by I mean small d democratic reform there, a lot of that is going to be wasted work. And in addition to that, anything we propose now has to survive in a hostile federal judiciary. I mean, the federal judiciary was packed with not just Trump judges, but Christian nationalist judges. I mean, including Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, and Neil Gorsuch too. I mean, this is a dire situation. I mean, if we do not expand and reform our courts, all the progressive and secular legislation and plans in the world don't matter, because they will get struck down. So it is something we are all working to do, but there are legit fires that have to be put out before we can really focus on rebuilding some of those things.
Thank you. Thank you. I did want to also point out that on 7/11, we do have a individual talking about Q, Candace Rondeau from ASU. She's a professor there, and she will be able to go into a lot of those more Q specific
Great
things from the QAnon shaman dude, yeah, and those kinds of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there's really fascinating studies that are coming out that are showing the overlap and between QAnon and Christian nationalism and QAnon and white evangelicalism and just the kind of the way there's some really fascinating news stories about the interview preachers and pastors and clergy who have seen this QAnon conspiracy just rip through their congregations. And to me, it's obvious. Like, I mean, when you insist that somebody suspend their skepticism and disbelief every Sunday for their entire lives, and tell them to believe the unbelievable, you are priming minds to accept conspiracy theories. And I actually wrote about this a little bit in the Founding Myth before QAnon was even born. It's an odd conspiracy because you can actually trace it back to the message board on one of those far right 4chan or 8chan or whatever message boards to the first time it came out. So you can really trace this conspiracy theory. It's great for scholars, hopefully like the one you're having, to study because of that. But anyway.
So Luke, we're going to get to your question a little bit. I want to keep it on the January 6th stuff for the next few minutes. John Wermass, he's curious how the various groups that stormed the Capitol interact. How did they view each other's motivation for being there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we're still learning about that. I mean, you have QAnon. It was a largely white crowd, and I try to touch on that a little bit. Where whenever I say Christian nationalism, I really am talking about white Christian nationalism, and I should be more careful. It's already a mouthful. For instance, if you ask Black Americans, is America a Christian nation? What does that mean to you? It's a very different, you get a very different set of responses than if you ask that same thing of white Americans. So Black Christian nationalism is not really a thing, but if you conceived of it, it would be something very, very different from what white Christian nationalism is. And for more on that, I would direct you to Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry have written a little bit about that. Robbie Jones, white too long. He runs PRRI. He's got some really great information on that. There's also the whole sort of militia aspect of this crowd, and the Proud Boys, and the other kind of neo-Nazi, white supremacist terrorist organizations that are on the periphery, and there's a ton of overlap amongst them. It is also kind of this sort of toxic stew where they all mix and flow together a lot. It's hard to draw distinct lines, and there is a lot of kind of just flow and osmosis back and forth. So I don't have a great answer for you on that, and part of that is because there's still a lot of information and a lot of studying going on about that.
It would be interesting to get a street epistemologist out there having those conversations in that kind of an environment.
There are so, I mean, with security around them, but yes.
Yeah. 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 So Angel asks, what is the worst thing that Christian nationalism can do to America that it hasn't already done?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for that, I'll say I don't think our democracy survived on January 6th because of the strength of our institutions. I think we got lucky. I mean, I'm certain we got lucky. I mean, if you really dig in and see how close, for instance, Chuck Schumer came to running into the mob, um, and read some of these stories about the people who were at the forefront and what they were trying to do, and the people who were barricaded in their offices, hearing people outside the offices pray for their deaths. Um, I think we got lucky. I don't know that people have woken up enough to realize how serious a violent threat this is. And I'm deeply concerned because there's active disinformation being pushed by politicians who seem to support the insurrection, who say it was just like a bunch of tourists going into the Capitol. I mean, in my mind, this is not over. We could easily see a repeat of this. And I don't know how it turns out next time. So again, I think we got lucky. I think it could. I mean, the attempt was to end American democracy, right? The goal was to overthrow a free and fair election. They wanted to stop the counting of the Electoral College, to stop the certification of the Electoral College, and they did. They were successful for it, at least for a time. I mean, there were a few quick-thinking staffers who grabbed those votes that could have grabbed all the paperwork and certifications. Who knows what would have happened if they had not thought to do that, or if the mob had been a little faster or a little more forceful. So, I mean, I think you could think about what is the worst that could have happened on January 6th and not be too far off. I mean, Mike Pence, like the head of our government, with the exception of Donald Trump and his Supreme Court, was in that building. Mike Pence, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, right? I mean, had that gone differently, and just even just a minute here or a minute there, we could be in a very, very different world right now. So yeah, and I mean, and let me just say too, let me back up here for a second too, because I like to make this clear when I do it. The central question that I ask in the founding myth is, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And you'll notice the question I ask is whether or not they positively influenced the founding. Because the we the people that embodies our constitutional identity is not fully realized. And I don't try to argue otherwise. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is from James Baldwin in Notes of a Native Son. He wrote, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and it is exactly for this reason that I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And I agree, and I criticize much, though maybe even not enough in the founding myth. And there are historical analogs you can look to see what is the worst that Christian nationalism could do, because you can see what it has justified throughout our history. And I try to do some of this criticism in the founding myth. I mean, take Thomas Jefferson, for example, okay? A moral coward, enslaved his own children. He could write of freedom eloquently. And he even condemned slavery in fervent and revealing terms, including in a draft of the Declaration of Independence. But at the same time, he owned slaves and fathered children with those slaves, who then became slaves. I mean, he is this paradox of cowardice. And he's one of America's great intellects, and he excelled at communicating these grand ideas in simple and poetic terms that still enthrall us today. But he just failed utterly, and in terrible ways, to practice those ideas. I mean, so that's the individual scale. And if you take it out to the national scale, there's even more to criticize, because many of America's founding principles are aspirational, or they were for a long time. And since our founding, successive generations have failed to fully implement those values, leaving it to their children to conquer human tragedies like slavery, like segregation, like the subjugation of half the American population. And so we've made progress towards including all people in We the People. And we've made strides towards genuine equality, but there's still more work to be done. And those as yet unmet goals don't alter our founding principles. They actually speak to our ability and appetite to realize those principles. And those are Judeo-Christian influences, right? Slavery, segregation, misogyny, our fetish for legislating sex. Those are poisonous influences that we need to purge from the body politic. And I mean, those are some of the historic influences of Christian nationalism that we're still feeling today. So, I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagining to think about what's the worst that Christian nationalism could do. We've got historical examples, and a little thought experiment with January 6th will get you there.
Yeah, the ideas are not great. I'm not pleased with that.
That's a good summation of my presentation. I like it. Yeah.
Less than stellar. So Luke asked, can you talk about the parsonage exemption and whether FFRF has made any progress on that front? We have our own, HSGP has our own test case on that issue currently.
Yeah. So the parsonage exemption, for people who don't know, is a sort of buried esoteric section of the IRS code that deals with income tax for quote, ministers of the gospel, end quote. And essentially, let's just pretend you're a church and you have a minister of the gospel. You can either give that minister a house to live in, which would be, the equivalent of giving them, free living space. They don't have to pay rent, all this stuff. It's a big boon to them. They wouldn't have to pay taxes on the value of that gift. Or you can give them part of their salary and designate it as a parsonage allowance, a housing allowance. So you could give them, say you pay them $100,000 a year, and you could say $25,000 of that is for housing, for the parsonage, for housing exemption. So the preacher, the clergy, does not have to pay income tax on that housing designated money, that money designated for housing. So instead of paying income tax on $100,000, they'd only pay income tax on $75,000. And it's only available to ministers of the gospel. It's not available to other people who run nonprofits. And it is subject to a lot of fraud and abuse. And I mean, think of it this way: you are paying more in taxes because Joel Osteen and Kenneth Copeland and all those mega preachers like Paula White, who live in, $10 million mansions, are not paying taxes because part of their salary is designated as housing. And you can imagine how much they can do for a $10 million house. So FFRF has tried to challenge this in a number of cases going back over a decade, including against one of the exemptions that Rick Warren tried to do with Saddleback Church a long time ago, and so far have not had much luck. It's a very clearly, in my mind, unconstitutional provision. But getting a court to weigh in on that has been very, very difficult. And there's, it's one of the areas where I think, it'd be an easy enough loophole to close if we ever were able to do, going back to the legislative agenda kind of questions that people were asking earlier. There'd be a very easy loophole to close at some point, but that, I don't know if we're going to get the chance to do that. But certainly looking for legislative options, and I'm all for supporting litigation on it.
Okay. I would encourage people to raise your hands if you want to ask your own questions. I will keep asking the questions you're putting in chat, though. So I want to tie these two next questions together. Lacey says, I know that one argument is that the founding fathers were Christian. What would be a potential rebuttal to that? And Anita says she was under the impression that the founding fathers wanted to be free from the Church of England, and they wanted to be free to believe as they chose. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, so that's chapter 1 of the founding myth. It's called Interesting and Irrelevant, the Religion of the Founders. I think it's a mistake for us to engage on the question of whether or not the founders were Christian or deist or atheist or whatever they believed, for a couple of reasons. One is you can find a quote to just support just about anything. Especially from the founders, and especially if you're using the internet, because there's a gajillion fake quotes out there. But also people's beliefs change over time, right? Like I don't believe the same thing now that I did when I was 17. George Washington didn't believe the same thing at 17 or at 47 or at 67. People's beliefs change, and then also what they're writing about. A private letter to a good friend versus a public missive meant to curry favor with voters is going to mean different things. But more importantly, when we engage on this, we are conceding ground that we should not be. Right? It's this. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a fascinating conversation, and if I was there in person, or maybe I'll come when this is over, in the after times, and we went out to a bar at the end of this, I could pontificate about George Washington's personal religious beliefs for hours, happily, especially if you got me a whiskey, an Irish whiskey. This is a man who when he rarely went to church, and when he did go to church, refused to take communion publicly, refused to kneel in prayer, did not have a single religious figure or any type of religious consolation around his deathbed, even though he took 24 solid hours to die. It was don't even get me started on the medicine, the doctors at his bedside. Anyway, nothing really. Didn't mention Jesus in his personal letters. When he spoke of God, spoke of it as divine providence, or in these very sort of sweeping theistic terms. So I'd be happy to have that conversation. But when we have it, we are conceding that it matters, that it makes a difference, that it's important. So because it's fascinating and we're interested in it, we're conceding this underlying argument that it actually matters who wins the argument, whether or not they were a Christian or whether or not they were a non-believer. And it doesn't. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is what principles they used to craft our Constitution, to write our laws, to design our government, right? So it is not relevant. And when we engage at that argument, we're losing immediately because we're conceding it. So that, and I get into that in depth in here, and then I actually show in chapter 2 how you really kind of can win that argument by turning it back on them, because this is essentially the founders did believe that religion was necessary for a society to survive, but they didn't think it was necessary for the educated elite, because they had studied philosophy, they had studied morality, they had studied ethics, and they were the elite. So you can extrapolate that, and I walk you through the argument in here, but essentially what that means is they did not use religion or religious principles to craft the government when they wrote the Constitution, when they drafted our laws, when they started, building the federal government from scratch in 1787, 1789, and writing our Bill of Rights, all of that stuff. You can actually disprove the Christian nationalist argument if you go about it the right way.
I would be interested in learning that method of disproving that. Ellen says she'll take you out to the bar for that conversation. And note for Irish whiskey. Got it.
Deal, Ellen.
Last question, it looks like, from Philip Lentz. It seems to me that human beings have a basic design flaw. Specifically, that the brain is capable and prone to the ability to believe things which are not true. Yeah. I don't know that that's a question, but when you're having that conversation with people who believe in the delusion, of this intelligence in the sky handing down morals and ethics, and not so much a deist, right? But those theists. Any things that you can provide to us, little pearls of wisdom that would make us go, yes, we've successfully planted that seed of doubt in that person?
Yeah, I mean, the two things that I always try to keep in mind are, I really do try to practice active listening, which is hard, and it's a skill you have to cultivate. Beyond that, the two things that I try to always keep in mind when I'm having these conversations are, one, temper your expectations, right? Do not expect to change somebody's mind right away. I mean, that to me is just absolutely key, and it's very, very easy to forget in the moment. And the second thing that I think is really important is to remember that these are people just like you and I. There is a tendency, and I'm not suggesting that anybody here would do this, but you do see it online. You do see it, there's a tendency to trash and denigrate believers, sometimes as maybe not intelligent. And I think that can eventually work its way into your mind if you're having these discussions. And I would really caution anybody against that, everybody against that. I mean, all we're talking about here is people changing their mind about a particular set of ideas. And it's a very thorny set of ideas. They have a lot of stickiness to them. They have a lot of built-in defense mechanisms to them, including things like shunning people and forcing people to go to church every week to reinforce those ideas. But really all we're talking about is people changing their mind. And I'm sure, like me, a ton of people who were once believers and who now are not. And these aren't people who gained 50 IQ points overnight. They just changed their mind about a few basic ideas. And that's because they were given additional, better information. Right? The mind, once enlightened, cannot again become dark, Thomas Paine said. And that's true. And all it is, it just takes a few different things to start shifting. And then it's a chain reaction that can't be stopped. So, I mean, don't go into it expecting that you can't change minds. Don't go into it expecting that you're going to change minds overnight. But think of it just as getting people to change their mind about a few basic things.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
I love that compassionate perspective. We've all, as humanists, had our beliefs challenged and hopefully changed our minds. I mean, that's one of those critical thinking skills that when confronted with better evidence, you change your mind, right? We would hope that everyone would manage that. So before we go, is there anything that you would like to say in closing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to encourage everybody to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We're doing fantastic work, and we need all the help we can get these days. You may have seen our Ron Reagan ad on TV lately. We're trying to really build up our membership. It is absolutely crucial that you join your voice with these national organizations, because it gives us a lot more clout when we're, for instance, trying to advocate for that legislative agenda in Washington or in the Arizona State Legislature. And please do pick up a copy of The Founding Myth. It's out right now on hardback. If you want the signed copy, you can do that through the FFRF website. It's on audiobook. Paperback is coming out soon, and you can pre-order that. I'd really appreciate that. That's a big boost for all authors. Plus, then you get a cool book that ties all that into January 6th, which is what we were just talking about. So yeah, those are my things.
Excellent. With that, as always, thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming to HSGP. Again, please subscribe and subscribe to our Patreon, become a member of HSGP. Be well, stay safe, and thank you very much.